And I'm not just talking your regular garden, neat and tidy rows of perfectly aligned plants. I'm talking wild gardens, ecological gardens. Now this is different. It's more of a wild store containing all sorts of foods, medicines, and plants that have many uses, all managed by nature. And it looks messy, but that's the point. When we look at traditional agriculture, not only is it destructive, inefficient, and produces subpar food in an unsustainable way, it's a hell of a lot of work. But if we let go of the order, we suddenly have less work. The gardens, to some extent, manage themselves. And it's so much deeper than the gardening. The garden is just a gateway to a different life, a different future for humanity. You see, permaculture, it's a revolution disguised as gardening. Do you think that something as inconsequential as growing your own food in your own backyard can change the future of humanity? And do you think that growing your own food will likely take all your time or is a bunch of backbreaking work? How do you garden or farm with nature as opposed to against it? Well, hang tight. We're going to find out the answers to this shortly. Welcome back to the Masterclass series on permaculture, the #1 essential tool for healthy and sustainable living. Now, if you recall in the first lesson, we talked about the power of permaculture and how it's the key ingredient to live a sustainable, if not regenerative life. In the second lesson, we talked about where to start with permaculture, which is in the garden and by connecting things such as chickens to the garden. And in the third lesson, we dove into how to bring soil to life and the critical difference between dead soil and alive soil, which will be the difference between a failed garden or a successful garden. And that brings me to this lesson here today. This is the 4th lesson in the series, Ecological Gardening. And I'm very excited for this one because this is the cornerstone of permaculture, the gateway into sustainable living. Now, if there's any one activity that people associate with sustainable living, healthy living, with permaculture, it's gardening or farming. And that's for good reason. Modern industrial agriculture is a huge problem today. The US food system alone produces 20% of the nation's carbon dioxide. It's eroding away topsoils at a rate of millions of tons per year. And it's creating massive and deadly algae blooms in the Gulf of Mexico from fertilizer runoff. But this is a global issue. Most every first world country faces these same issues. Think of it this way. Simply imagine how far that bunch of bananas or avocados that you eat has to travel before reaching your home. How many machines and vehicles were involved in the harvest, processing, packing, and transporting and preservation of that single piece of food? Now imagine simply walking out your door and harvesting some charred potatoes and berries. Yeah, strange combination for lunch, I know. But can you start to see how massive of an impact on the state of the world you can have simply by localizing your food to your backyard or even your neighborhood? So don't underestimate the power of even a simple small garden. It can be the beginning of massive change. Now in this lesson here, we're going to dive into what an ecological garden actually is. This could be also called a permaculture garden, and we'll go into how to get started with it. Specifically in this lesson, you're going to discover how an ecological garden is completely different from a conventional garden, with less work, less time required. And you're going to learn 2 easy to implement strategies to turn your garden into an ecological one. And you're going to discover how a food forest can yield decades of food with almost no work. And remember, this video here is only available for 24 hours. So you need to watch it today, otherwise you're going to miss critical information that you'll need to know for the last lesson. So to start, I want to address a few problems that people tend to have head on to ensure that they're not excuses as to why you can't do what I'm about to teach you today. First, I don't have a green thumb as an excuse. Well, very few people do. Just like how most people can't pick up a violin and play it. Most people need to practice to productively grow a garden. But unlike a violin, gardening is way easier because plants only need 3 things: enough sunlight, healthy soil, which we already talked about, and of course water, and not so much water that the soil is always wet. But you won't ever have a garden if you don't try and fail a few times, even at certain crops. Now here's a key. Start small if you've never had a garden before. Don't plant an entire bedrow of tomatoes if you've never gardened. Instead, plant 3 to 5, which is enough plants to cover your bases if 1 or 2 die, but not so many that it's completely unmanageable. The second excuse is, I don't have the space. Do you have a patio or a balcony? Then you can grow in containers. Sure, you might not grow more than 25% of your veggie needs, but it's a massive start. Remember Rob Greenfield, the person we talked about in lesson 2? He grew 100% of his diet on neighbors' lawns. So there should be no reason why every person isn't growing at least some herbs like basil and cilantro at home in a windowsill. All right, let's get started with the ecological garden. Now, permaculture is all about nurturing natural environments because we recognize that natural environments provide the support for our human needs, from food to pest control, lumber, and more. And we've talked about how permaculture is all about making connections. Well, how do we actually do that? The ecological garden is actually a great place to start with that. Now, the ecological garden, it's an incredible example of building a garden that's integrated with nature, not separate from nature like most every monoculture farm you've seen. We are not separate from nature, we are nature. So when we create ecological gardens, we get to experience nature firsthand, encourage it, and harvest our necessities all at the same time, right? This is the symbiotic relationship that we're striving for. An ecological garden is one that melds the best features of wild gardens, edible landscapes, food forests, and even conventional flower and vegetable gardens into one. And of course, permaculture gives us time-tested techniques honed to perfection by indigenous gardeners, restoration agroecologists, organic farmers, and even cutting-edge landscape designers. They combine low environmental impact, low maintenance, once established, and high yields with aesthetics and elegance. Ecological gardens are filled with beautiful plants that have many uses, providing fruit, vegetables, medicinal, culinary herbs, and eye-catching arrays of colorful blossoms, soil-building mulch, and protection from pests, wildlife habitat even. Now, these landscapes can even yield income from edible and medicinal plants, seeds and nursery stock, or dried flowers. They provide construction and craft materials such as lumber, bamboo, poles, basket willow, and vegetable dyes. Yet, in a garden designed along with ecological principles, birds and other animals feel just as welcome in these living landscapes as gardeners too. So with good design, these ecological gardens need only infrequent watering, and the soil renews itself rather than demanding heavy fertilization. These are living ecosystems designed using nature's rules and boasting the lushness, the resilience of natural environments. Now, when I first heard about permaculture, gardening, ecological gardening, I wanted to see one because I thought if I could see it, I would be more easily able to replicate it. Kind of in the way how you can look at a giant field of corn and you just know it's monoculture. What does an ecological garden look like? What I learned was that you actually can't see an ecological garden. It doesn't necessarily look like any one style of gardening. It's not about how the garden looks, though. That can give you some clues. It's more about the connections that the garden has, connections to the home, the animals, to nature, to make it an ecological garden. As a garden becomes more connected, it becomes more resilient and sustainable. It becomes less work and more fun. Now, a lot of the tools and techniques to create an ecological garden are designed to help you create connections. For example, plant gilding to connect beneficial plants. But in addition to that, some of the connection comes from outside the garden. For example, connecting ducks or chickens to the garden for pest control or tilling. But if I had to give you a generalized description, an ecological garden often looks more like nature. It's more of a wild garden where the plants layer, bedrows seem to blend. Some plants are in vegetative states while some are in flower. Many of the images I've shown so far are the best images I have captured of ecological gardens. And yet it's hard to identify sometimes what is going on or what is even growing in most of them. The gardens might have some order to some extent, but overall, plants are allowed to intermingle, grow on their own terms, form their own niches in the spaces between the beds and more. That's because they're emulating natural systems. And natural systems are not so organized and linear as people like them to be. Ecological gardens are about letting go of the need for order and control to a reasonable extent and allowing the garden to take its own course. The ecological garden is a garden that simply works for you and encourages the natural environment. They can be mixed and matched because they're synergistic. They can work together to create rich and connected landscape. For example, using cover crop in a bed one year and then using deep mulch in another year will introduce different nutrients, different beneficial soil organisms into that particular environment. Now, a landscape's natural tendency is to mature. A desert turns into a grassland, which turns into a forest. This is called natural succession or ecological succession. So, in order for our gardens to follow this natural order, we need to allow them to mature. It'll be less work, less energy, with more yield. Here's an example of an immature garden. Nothing wrong with it, it's just more of a conventional garden. There's less biomass, more exposed soil, and more focus on annual planting and planting for human needs. Whereas here is a more mature garden. See how it begins to look more like a young forest? We can certainly have all the same annuals, such as kale and chard, but in addition to that, we leverage trees, perennials, vertical space, multifunction plants, herbs, and more. So, here are some of the characteristics of an immature garden versus a mature ecological garden. Here we can see different attributes, such as size of organisms, and compare them in an immature system versus a mature ecosystem. In this case, there would mostly be small organisms in an immature system, whereas a mature system would also include larger organisms. Or the biomass in a mature system would be high. Organic matter in a mature system would be high, and so on. So this is what we're aiming for with the ecological garden, a more mature garden system. All right, so what are some of the actual tools and strategies permaculture offers to create the ecological garden? Here are a few of the primary strategies for ecological gardening, 4 of which I will introduce you to here in this lesson. First, it's worth pointing out that an ecological garden always starts with creating healthy soil, as we talked about in the previous lesson. Because if the soil is not alive, nor will your garden be. And generating soil is an ongoing strategy in the garden because you need to ensure that soil nutrients are replenished annually to make up for the nutrients that the plants remove. Gardening is actually nutrient farming. Humans ingest the plants and absorb the nutrients from the plants. The plants received the nutrients from the soil life, and the soil life received the nutrients from the soil. Now, this recycling of nutrients can be made as simple as chopping and dropping, for example. In our garden, we remove very few materials. When plants are done, or of damaged plants, such as kale left over in a bed at the end of a season, I simply cut it down and leave it to decompose in place. This is cycling nutrients in place, providing food for soil life and building the soil without the need of a compost pile. You can even do this with fruit trees. When pruning, I simply leave the branches at the base of the tree to provide mulch cover, moisture retention, soil life habitat, and future food for that tree. Now, chop and drop in the garden is less work, and I'm all about that. But let's move on since this lesson is more about the garden than the soil. All right, to begin with, all plants perform different functions in nature, some more than others. In traditional gardens, plants are often chosen for a single purpose, to feed humans. The problem with this is that it makes more work for people in the long run. It's what makes traditional gardening or farming so much work, is the plant choice. But if we can connect the garden back to nature by incorporating plants of different uses or multifunction plants, then all of a sudden we create a healthier garden that requires less work. So here are some different functions that plants can serve in a garden. So we have mulch makers, plants with lots of biomass that drops and covers soil, protecting it. We have nutrient accumulators, plants that pull up nutrients from deep in the soil with long taproots. We have nitrogen fixers, plants that take in nitrogen from the atmosphere and make it available in our soils. We have plants that are pest repellents, plants that naturally deter pests. We have insectary plants, which are plants that attract beneficial pollinators. And we have tilling plants, plants that use their big, deep roots to aerate soils. And we have plants that are a wildlife shelter and habitat, which attract beneficial animals into the garden. And we have plants that are, of course, food, the plants that feed humans or beneficial animals. We have medicine plants, the plants that provide healing for animals or people. So, did you have any idea that plants performed all of these ecological functions? So let's look at an example. Some plants, like your beloved kale, are plants with fewer uses. They're mostly just a food source for humans and aphids. Kale extracts nutrients from the soil, so we need to offset that by integrating plants to accumulate nutrients. But first, let's understand plant nutrients. Plants need in large quantities nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. This is the NPK that you might see on a label on a plant fertilizer at the garden store. Now, for most people, they will go the route of store-bought organic fertilizers and feed the plant to replenish the soil. And this costs time, this costs money, and this costs energy, right? And it's not sustainable either. It's not connecting the garden to the native landscape to fill needs. Instead, we can plant plants that are dynamic nutrient accumulators. For example, you could plant chamomile with the kale, or after the kale has been harvested, which chamomile is a dynamic nutrient accumulator. It brings up nutrients from deep in the soil to the surface. And of course, chamomile can then also be used for healing tea. This is what we call stacking functions in permaculture, implementing plants, tools, strategies that accomplish more than one goal at a time. Now, below the video, I have a chart for you of popular plants that you can use in your garden that serve multiple functions, including accumulating nutrients. So be sure to get these plants in your ecological gardens. Now, there are different ways to use multifunction plants. They can be mixed into vegetable beds. They can be planted at the end of the beds. They can be planted in the beds. They can be planted in between planting successions, which brings me to the next potential strategy for creating an ecological garden. Now, a plant guild is simply a plant community or a grouping of plants that all help each other in some way. Now, guilds are one way to bridge the broad gap between conventional vegetable gardens and wildlife gardens by creating plant communities that act and feel like natural landscapes, but that include humans in their webwork. Here we see a peach tree guild and all of the plants that go with the peach tree in some sort of beneficial way. Some plants attract pollinators, some help add nutrients to the soil, and others do these plus other services, including provide food for the people. We can see rhubarb, asparagus, thyme, and currant, all in this functional fruit tree guild. And each performs a function, right? Builds soil, accumulates nutrients, adds organic matter, attracts beneficial insects, repels pests, and of course provides food or other resources for humans. All right, so are you starting to see how we create gardens in support of nature while getting our needs met? You see, permaculture simply looks to science and observation of nature to understand what everything does, like clover, which brings nitrogen into the soil, for example, and then uses that information to help us design the best gardens, homes, and homesteads possible. And yes, this idea of gilding plants is a departure from conventional rows of single plant species. It's a departure from monoculture. And plant gilding is very similar to what we call a food forest. And if you saw an earlier video, I mentioned this. Now, food forests are as close to a no-work garden as you can get. And that's not to say there isn't an initial investment of time into the garden to establish it, but once it is established, you can maintain a food forest with less energy and time than a traditional annual garden. So, what exactly is a food forest? Now, a food forest is a garden that is a perennial polyculture designed like a forest. So let's take that apart a bit. Now, a perennial is a plant that regrows season after season on its own for more than 2 years. For example, a fruit tree, a raspberry, or artichokes are all perennials. Whereas an annual plant are ones that only live one season and then die, kale, onions, and so on. As you can already imagine, annuals require more work than perennials. Next is polyculture, which is growing more than one species in one space, mimicking natural ecosystems. This is opposed to monoculture, which, if you can imagine, is just the fields of corn, wheat, or any other crop. And next, designed like a forest means that we look to vertical layers to maximize effect, stack functions in an ecological garden, in a food forest. You see, forests are the most evolved and resilient ecosystems with the most biodiversity. And we can create those attributes in our gardens by creating a forest garden modeled after nature's perfect design. And what food forests do is they provide the 5 F's: food, fuel, fiber, fodder, fertilizer, and pharmaceuticals. So, where can you grow a food forest? Anywhere people tend to live in mass, really, aside from polar regions or high alpine tundra, which are areas that forests simply cannot grow. If you want to equate it to the USDA zones, 3 and colder is where it gets difficult. This means that food forests can be established in most any temperate climate, tropical climate, and even desert climates. Now, it's easiest to grow a food forest where forests already grow, especially deciduous forests. Deciduous forests are ones that the majority of plants lose their leaves during the winter. Now, this indicates that your region's climate has enough rainfall during the growing season and mild enough winters during the winter season. But you can certainly grow a food forest in the desert. If you remember Jeff Lawton's Greening the Desert project we showed you earlier. So, what changes between food forests in different climates, outside of regions where deciduous forests grow, is mostly species selection, which is simply aligning the plant choice to your hardiness zone. We already talked about that in an earlier lesson. So, you can look to local forest models to understand forest gardening in different climates. Now, there might be some small management differences between food forests in different climates, but all the concepts applied to all the major climate zones. Now, a key distinction I want to make here is that food forests are gardening like a forest, but not in a forest, as pointed out by Dave Jacke and Eric Tonesmeyer. You can garden in a forest, but that's different, and they'll be talked about separately. Now, a note here is that while it's called a food forest is in terms of ecological succession, which we talked about earlier in the lessons, not yet a mature forest with a closed canopy, okay? A food forest will have a more open canopy that still allows light to reach the ground. That critical piece alone should answer the question of how do I grow plants in the shade of a forest? You don't. Food forests are mid-succession environments in transition from basically a shrubland to a forest. So in a forest garden in the northern hemisphere, the trees will likely have a sunny south side and a shady north side. So you can get a mix of light conditions in the food forest, different growing conditions. The sunny side is on the south side, and this is where you plant the plants that love sun. And of course, it's reversed for the southern hemisphere. Here we see the side view or profile of a forest garden. So on the back side, or the top of this hill, is maybe an existing forest, or trees that you've planted that will become the tallest at maturity, walnut trees, for example. Then working your way down the diagram, or downhill on the slope, the height of the plants in the forest garden decreases. Next are your sun-loving trees, such as stone or palm fruits, with some shorter plants at the base on the south side. Further to the right, or downhill, are lower shrubs and perennials, eventually working your way down to maybe grassland. It's worth noting that while the stigma is that food forests are just perennial, really, there can be annuals all in here too. Annuals such as kale, tomatoes, potatoes can all grow on the sunny south sides of the trees or in the spaces between the trees and the shrubs. Or instead of a grassland on the far right, you can transition to a more open annual garden bed system. Now, here's a top view or a plan view of the forest garden. We can see that just like a regular garden, the plants are arranged in rows. But note that the rows are on contour and not straight. These contour lines are equal elevation across a slope and will prevent soil erosion, collect rainwater, and provide easy access along your paths. The contours could even be water harvesting swales that are planted. Swales are just ditches across a slope to harvest rainwater that would otherwise run off, but that's a whole different wormhole for another day. What's critical here is that canopy spacing. By planting the trees far enough apart, we ensure that it doesn't become an enclosed forest. Rather, it stays more like an open woodland, which has less tree density in an area. So, what I hope you can start seeing here is that a food forest is an ecological garden mixed with a forest, mixed with an orchard, all mimicking a natural forest. And the advantage of a food forest is that a large number of the plants involved are perennial plants, which live for many years, providing years of food from one plant with only a little bit of upfront investment. Now, I'm not going to lie and say you can grow your food or live sustainably without giving up any time, but you can do it in ways that don't take up your entire life. Check out this 5-year-old food forest converted from a lawn. James here produces a massive amount of food with little work. I recommend you Google lawn to food forest to watch his YouTube video. Okay, friends, how are you doing? Are you enjoying this stuff? To recap here, this lesson we talked about ecological gardens, what they are, and 2 strategies to use: multi-use plants and plant gilding to move your conventional garden more towards a low-work, connected ecological garden. And you also learned what a food forest is and how incredibly awesome they are. One of my favorite experiences was when I lived in Hawaii, and I could just walk out into this unmaintained food forest and harvest avocados and mangoes all the time from a self-managed system. One that had so many connections, it provided for its own needs and didn't require any other human tending other than harvesting. Now, tomorrow is a really big day that I'm even more excited for. And yes, I know I'm excited about a lot of this stuff, but tomorrow's video is a little bit different. The end of tomorrow's video includes a limited time opportunity for those of you who are ready to take action on these teachings and begin creating a permaculture life. But before that, I want to ask you, do you think it's possible that the ecological garden is only a small piece of a bigger picture that is sustainable living? And if so, then what does that exactly look like? In other words, what ways of living and being outside of the ecological garden are there? And lastly, do you think that nature can provide all of the needs for your life? Well, the answers to all of that is in tomorrow's video. So look for it in your inbox at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Now, I have 2 things for you to do, okay? First, comment below this video and tell me if you have a garden or not, and if you see how an ecological garden would increase the health of your garden, decrease the workload, and provide better yields. And second, join my free Facebook community called The Holistic Homestead. It's a great way for you to learn even more from me as I post more trainings there. Link for that is below the video. So, to wrap this lesson up with a quote from Bill Mollison, "The greatest change we need to make is from consumption to production, even if on a small scale in our own gardens. If only 10% of us did this, there would be enough for everyone." With that in mind, I will see you in tomorrow's lesson.